This story started for us in the summer of 2022 when we requested forms detailing all of the Army's non-combat deaths from Army Human Resources Command. What we found ultimately was that holders of the 19 kilo MOS, which is enlisted tank crew members, had a suicide rate nearly 3 times higher than the rest of the Army between 2019 and 2021. Tankers, in fact, had the highest suicide rate of any large career field. We also found that members of armored brigade combat teams, regardless of their MOS, were more than twice as likely than other members of the active duty force to kill themselves. And we also found that among the service's ABCTs, these deaths were fairly evenly distributed. There were no obvious outliers. Every single Army tank brigade, in fact, had a higher suicide rate during that 3-year window than the Army-wide average. So we went to suicide experts, we went to tank community experts, and we started going to the soldiers themselves to ask, why might this be the case? What do we need to be looking into? The answer we got back from almost all of them was how hard the Army's tank units have been working for the past 10 years. The roots of this crisis run pretty deep. Beginning in the early 2010s, the Army closed many of its overseas bases in Germany and Korea that included forward stationed armor brigades. The idea behind those original basing decisions was to have those units on hand in theater to deter enemy aggression. But even as the funding to keep them there dried up, the need for it didn't. As these requirements mounted on the Army's tank brigades, that meant that their time at home between deployments started to shrink as well. Eventually, most of them settled into a cycle where they would spend 9 months abroad, 18 months at home, and then 9 months abroad again. As the pace intensified, however, the quality of those 18 months at home started to decrease. They would have to go to combat training centers and complete 6-week rotations there. To go to a CTC rotation, you've got to qualify at a brigade training event. Then you have battalion events, company events, platoon events. You've got to qualify your individual tank and Bradley crews. And the whole way, you have to take these vehicles out into the field to meet these training benchmarks. And when they do that, they're going to break. The stress from that was compounded by constant backlogs on maintenance parts and shrinkage of the maintenance force associated with some reforms to force structure. All of these things compounded themselves into a cycle where these tank brigades were spending increasingly less time with their families, even when they were at home, despite the fact that none of them were really fighting overseas anymore. One of the mental health experts with whom I spoke, Dr. Craig Bryan of Ohio State University, he's a former Air Force psychologist, and he wrote a 2022 book called Rethinking Suicide. In it, Bryan is one of the experts on the leading edge of a new wave of suicide research that theorizes everybody is at risk of suicide if they reach a certain stress level. He said that in the military specifically, as a member of the Pentagon's Suicide Prevention Committee, he has found that operational tempo, or those deployments, and those long, unpredictable working hours are significant sources of daily stress for soldiers, and even more so for members of armored brigade combat teams. The way he put it was that it's like death by 1,000 paper cuts for these soldiers. They are put at a slightly greater risk of suicide with each daily hassle they experience. You have a community of soldiers that is collectively closer to the brink because of a combination of policy and operational decisions made over the past 10 years by the Army, the Defense Department, and Congress. There are some things happening outside the suicide prevention world that hold some promise. The Army has taken a few steps to reduce operational tempo by changing the Korea deployment from tanks to Stryker brigades. They've also changed the Kuwait deployment to National Guard armor brigades. But even so, the Iron Knight Battalion at Fort Carson is about to deploy for another 9 months or 8 months after barely having 15, 16 months at home since their last Europe deployment. That said, they're trying to find ways to reduce maintenance strains at some armor heavy installations. Fort Cavazos, Texas, home of the 1st Cavalry Division, which is one of the heaviest in the Army, they're going to establish a new company commander and first sergeant course and establish a new battalion executive officer course that is geared partially to helping these leaders understand how to run maintenance programs without running their soldiers into the ground. We're not sure yet what's going to happen yet as a result of our reporting. Stick with us, viewers. We're going to keep following this and keep everybody informed about updates in military suicide. For Army Times, I'm Davis Winke.